Right now, somewhere in Africa, an elephant is being born without tusks. Not because of a random genetic accident, because of us. Every living thing on this planet is locked in a constant negotiation with its environment. Change the environment, and life changes with it. That is the deal evolution has always operated on. But for the last few centuries, and especially the last few decades, one species has been rewriting the rules of that negotiation faster than anything in the history of this planet. You. And everything around you is already responding. This is not about the future. This is not a warning about what might happen. This is about what is happening right now, documented in peer-reviewed research, measurable in real populations, visible in the genetics of animals alive today. Evolution does not always take millions of years. Sometimes it takes 50. Let us start in Africa. In Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, something deeply strange began showing up in elephant populations after the country's civil war ended in 1992. Researchers studying the park's elephants noticed that an unusually high number of females were being born without tusks. Not smaller tusks, no tusks at all. Tusklessness is a genetic trait. In a normal elephant population, roughly 2 to 4% of females are born naturally tuskless. It is rare. It has always been rare. But in Gorongosa, by the time researchers Shane Campbell-Staton and his colleagues published their findings in the journal Science in 2021, tusklessness in females born after the war had reached 51%. Half the female elephants in the park had no tusks. The mechanism is brutal in its simplicity. During the Civil War, poachers killed elephants for ivory. The elephants with the largest, most valuable tusks were killed first and most often. The elephants most likely to survive long enough to reproduce were the ones with the smallest tusks, or in rare cases, no tusks at all. Over enough generations, the gene pool shifted. Tusklessness became an advantage where it had once been a neutral quirk. Here is where the science becomes genuinely unsettling. The gene responsible for tusklessness in females appears to be linked to the X chromosome. In males, inheriting this gene variant is nearly always lethal before birth. The same pressure that pushed tusklessness higher in females was simultaneously killing male embryos carrying the gene. The sex ratio in the population shifted dramatically. More females survived, fewer males were born, and a population of elephants emerged where half the females had permanently lost the tusks their species had used for hundreds of thousands of years to dig water, strip bark, and defend themselves. This was not planned. It was not managed. It happened because humans created a selection pressure so intense that evolution had no choice but to respond. Now go to the ocean. Atlantic cod have been one of the most commercially fished species on Earth for centuries. The fishing industry has always had a preference. Keep the biggest fish, the fastest growers, the ones that reach the largest size. Generation after generation, the fish most likely to be removed from the gene pool before reproducing were the large, late maturing ones. The fish most likely to survive long enough to pass on their genes were the small, fast maturing ones. Researcher David Conover at Stony Brook University ran controlled experiments replicating exactly this process and found that the evolutionary response was rapid and measurable. In the wild Atlantic cod population, the average age of sexual maturity dropped from around 6 or 7 years old in the mid-20th century to around 4 years by the 1990s. Body size at maturity shrank by roughly 20% over the same period. These were not individual fish getting smaller. The gene pool itself had shifted. Smaller and earlier had become the new normal because everything larger and later had been systematically removed before it could reproduce. This process is called fisheries-induced evolution, and it has now been documented in dozens of commercially harvested species. Salmon, tuna, herring, all showing measurable genetic shifts in body size and life history traits in direct response to industrial harvesting pressure. The part that should concern you is this. When fishing pressure is reduced or removed, the population does not simply return to its original form. Evolved traits are not a temporary adjustment. Reversing fisheries-induced evolution may take centuries. The cod fishery off Newfoundland collapsed in 1992 and has still not recovered to anything close to its historical state more than 30 years later. Part of the reason may be that the fish themselves have been permanently changed. Now come into the cities. Urban environments are one of the most extreme habitats on Earth. Concrete absorbs and radiates heat. Artificial light runs through the entire night. Food sources bear almost no resemblance to anything in natural ecosystems. Noise levels are orders of magnitude above anything most animals evolved to communicate through. And for the animals that moved into cities, The selection pressure created by all of this is producing measurable evolutionary change on timescales of decades. White-footed mice living in New York City's urban parks have been studied extensively by evolutionary biologist Jason Munchie South at Fordham University. His team found that urban mouse populations have developed genetic differences from their rural relatives in regions of the genome associated with metabolism, cardiac function, and diet processing. City mice are eating processed food waste, saturated fats, and human food scraps. Their physiology is measurably adapting to metabolize that diet efficiently. The mutations are already detectable in the genome after fewer than 100 generations of urban life. Then there is birdsong. Great tits across dozens of European cities have measurably changed the frequency and tempo of their songs compared to great tits in rural areas of the same country. The research, conducted by Hans Slaberkorn at Leiden University and later replicated across multiple species and continents, found that city birds sing at higher frequencies, with shorter and faster phrases than their rural counterparts. The reason is straightforward. Low-frequency sounds get drowned out by traffic noise, construction, and the constant low rumble of urban infrastructure. Birds that sing at higher frequencies cut through that noise, reach more potential mates, and reproduce more successfully. What makes this evolution rather than learned behaviour is the crucial detail. The frequency shift is present even in birds raised in isolation from other city birds, with no exposure to urban song. It is in the genetics. Natural selection has rewired the vocal tendencies of urban bird populations within decades. Now something happening at the chemical level. In the 1950s, a pesticide called dieldrin was introduced to agricultural areas across Europe and North America. It was extraordinarily effective at killing insects and extraordinarily toxic to everything else, accumulating in fat tissue and building up through the food chain until predatory birds were absorbing dangerous concentrations with every meal. House sparrows and other small birds in agricultural areas began dying in large numbers. Dieldrin disrupted the GABA-A receptor in the nervous system, essentially jamming the brain's off switch for neural activity, causing seizures and death. But some birds survived. Researcher Andrew Brooks and colleagues later found that in sparrow populations with long-term exposure to dieldrin, a specific genetic variant had spread rapidly through the population. The variant altered the structure of the GABA-A receptor in a way that made it significantly less sensitive to the pesticide. Birds carrying this variant could tolerate doses that killed their counterparts outright. What makes this finding extraordinary is that the exact same mutation was later found to have evolved independently in multiple different bird species across different continents, all exposed to the same class of pesticides. Completely separate evolutionary paths arriving at the identical molecular solution. Same selection pressure, same target, same answer. Convergent evolution at the single gene level, happening within decades rather than millions of years. Now go deeper, into the water. Microplastics have reached every corner of the ocean. They have been found in the deepest ocean trenches, in Arctic sea ice, in the bloodstream of seabirds, and in the gut contents of virtually every marine organism tested. For most animals, microplastics represent a slow accumulation of toxicity, digestive blockages, leaching chemicals, reduced reproductive success. But life is already adapting. Copepods are tiny crustaceans, most smaller than a grain of rice, that form the foundation of the marine food chain. They are among the most important animals in the ocean. Virtually nothing in the sea survives without them. Researcher Rachel Jensen and colleagues, studying copepod populations in heavily polluted versus clean water environments, found that copepods from polluted sites showed heritable resistance to the toxic effects of microplastic-associated chemicals that populations from clean water did not. The resistance passed from parent to offspring. It was in the genetics. Copepods reproduce at extraordinary rates, dozens of generations per year. That rapid generation time means natural selection can cycle through enough generations in a few decades to produce detectable genetic change. The same process that takes millennia in an elephant takes years in a copepod. And right now, in polluted harbours and coastal waters around the world, copepod populations are quietly evolving resistance to a form of pollution that has only existed for 70 years. Now the most dramatic example of all. Blackcap warblers are small migratory songbirds that traditionally spent winters in sub-Saharan Africa. Every autumn they flew south from their European breeding grounds, crossed the Mediterranean, crossed the Sahara, and overwintered in the warm south before returning north in spring. That had been the pattern for thousands of years. Over the last 50 years, a growing population of blackcap warblers has stopped going to Africa. Instead, they fly northwest in autumn and spend winter in Britain, feeding on the food that British households now reliably leave out in gardens year-round. Suet balls, peanuts, sunflower seeds, an artificial food source that did not exist at meaningful scale until the late 20th century. Researcher Peter Berthold at the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology tracked this population split across decades and found something remarkable. The birds migrating northwest to Britain were not just behaving differently, they were changing. Their wings had become shorter and more rounded, better suited for the shorter migration. Their beaks had become slightly longer and narrower, better suited for picking seeds from feeders rather than foraging in African scrubland. Their migration timing had shifted, and because they arrived back at European breeding grounds slightly earlier than the Africa wintering birds and from a different direction, they were more likely to mate with other northwest migrants than with Africa migrants. In roughly 50 years, two populations of the same species have developed different migration routes, different wintering diets, measurably different wing morphology, measurably different beak morphology, and different breeding timing. They are not yet classified as separate species, but the genetic divergence between the two populations is already measurable, and it is growing with every generation. We are watching speciation happen, the actual splitting of one species into two, driven in large part by British people putting peanut feeders in their gardens. Here is what all of these examples have in common. Evolution does not care about intentions. We did not set out to create tuskless elephants. We did not plan to miniaturize cod or rewire bird vocal cords or split a warbler species in two. We created selection pressure, and life responded the way it always has, by changing. The difference between now and every previous period in evolutionary history is the speed. Natural selection normally works across thousands of generations. What we are doing is compressing that timeline into decades by creating selection pressures so intense, so consistent, and so global that evolution has no choice but to accelerate. Some of these changes are biologically neutral. Some are genuinely fascinating windows into how fast life can move when it has to. But some, like tuskless elephants that can no longer dig for water in droughts, and cod that may never return to their original size, are signs of systems being damaged in ways that may take centuries to repair, if they can be repaired at all. The planet is not waiting. It is not static. It is not passively enduring what we do to it. It is already responding. It has always responded. And the next time you put food out for the birds, or throw something in the ocean, or make a choice about what you eat, somewhere out there, in a genome you will never see, evolution is already taking notes. So you wanted to know which animals are evolving right now because of us. Now you know. The question is, what we are going to do with that. Evolution does not stop here. How lizards became snakes, right here. How sharks survived 450 million years and 5 mass extinctions, right here. Subscribe.